Well, welcome back to our study of the book of Judges. This week we're going to be talking about Samuel in the third part about him. 2 weeks ago we talked about his birth. Last week we saw his boyhood and his growing up and some of the visits that his parents had with him. This week we're going to get into Samuel's work as the last of the great judges, the greatest of them actually in my opinion, and the first of the prophets. He's kind of a bridge character, and we're going to see what happened into his adult life, and he being the last of the judges, also bringing in the first king of Israel. So much to do, and we're looking forward to going through this with you. And so let's just begin, if you would please turn in your Bibles to 1 Samuel 4. 1 Samuel 4. I'll give you just a minute to get there. We're going to start our study today by looking at the biblical description of two battles. Remember, the judges were brought in that forever cycle that we keep hearing about over these 300 some years, where Israel would fall into sin and then God would decide to chastise them. And after some chastising, they would come to their senses and call out to God, and he would respond and send them a judge to deliver them. And almost always there was involved some kind of a battle or a fight with nations that God had brought there to chastise them. And so same with Samuel. As a judge, he was involved as well with some warfare. It's the first time we're going to see it here in the book, but it's very real. And we start with these two battles. The first one is at Ebenezer. It's found there in chapter 4, verse 1. Ebenezer. And they're going to be defeated here. Look at verses 1 and 2. I'll read it for you. And the word of Samuel came to all Israel. Now Israel went out against the Philistines to battle, and pitched beside Ebenezer, and the Philistines pitched at Aphek. And the Philistines put themselves in array against Israel, and when they had joined battle, Israel was smitten before the Philistines, and they slew of the army in the field about 4,000 men. Now, we don't know what exactly was before this, but just that Samuel calls Israel to go into battle. He is their judge, and he's leading them into battle. And we have to understand that God had a reason for this, but it wasn't really revealed to us in this particular part of the chapter. So what we know is very simple. Probably, and certainly it seems likely through God's leadership, Samuel said, let's go to battle. We need to fight the Philistines. But then when they got there, God did not give them the victory. Now, over and over again in the Old Testament, and especially in the prophets, we see God saying to the children of Israel, I will, if you will fulfill your part of the covenant there, the Mosaic covenant, then I will be your God and I will fight your battles for you. But if not, I won't. And you'll have these various bad things happen to you that happened in the land of Egypt. So they're going out to fight, and instead they lose 4,000 men. Well, what's worse, they're going to have another battle, and it's even going to go worse. But let's just look at verse 3 now, and we're going to see about the bringing of the ark into the camp. And when the people were come into the camp, the elders of Israel said, Why has the Lord smitten us today before the Philistines? Let us fetch the ark of the covenant of the Lord out of Shiloh unto us, that when it comes among us, it may save us out of the hand of our enemies. So the people went to Shiloh, that they might bring from there the ark of the covenant of the Lord of hosts, which dwells between the cherubims. And the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were there with the ark of the covenant of God. And when the ark of the covenant of the Lord came into the camp, all Israel shouted with a great shout, so that the earth rang again. Now, why did they do this, and what was the reaction? Why was there such a reaction to this? Well, there's one point of reference. You don't have to turn there, but let me just read for you Numbers 10:35. This is another place that we see this happening. And we get kind of the same thing. And it came to pass, Numbers 10:35, when the ark set forward, that Moses said, "Rise up, Lord, and let your enemies be scattered, and let them that hate you flee before you." Moses was calling in that case upon God to rise up and fight the battle for Israel. And remember, that was exactly what the Lord had told him he would do. But it was there with the ark, so that Moses was walking with the priests and the ark, and right there with the ark, rise up, O Lord, and let your enemies be scattered. And God did that so many times. But now, you can see the deep state of sin and ignorance of God's law that Israel is in these latter times of the last judge, because they have taken the emphasis off of God being with them. God had to be with them in order to win, and they had transposed that onto the ark. And this has been Israel's sin all the way along. Remember, with the giving of the laws, Moses comes down the mountain with the law and sees that they're worshiping an idol, a bull that's been made. And they've given up their gold and silver, and Aaron made this bull. They said, we don't know where Moses went. We want somebody to worship. And while they were doing that, they thought they were worshiping the Lord. And this continues to be a problem, you see. This idol worship is always an issue. It's an issue when God speaks to Israel. It's an issue when we come to the prophets and God speaks against Israel. And here they've taken away the idea of we'll go and fight our battles if God is with us. They can't do that anyway because they're in such sin. He would never do that until they got that straightened out. But their understanding is darkened, and they see this ark is kind of a magic thing, talisman, if you want to call it that, lucky charm. And they figure, well, if we have the ark with us, God will give us the victory. And they have that little smattering of truth about Moses calling upon God to fight for them when they were marching with the ark. But they've lost the God part, and it's all about the ark. Well, the next part actually shows you something of the sense of humor of the Lord, I think. At least that's the way I look at it. You'll see how you feel when we go to it. They're coming here and they've got the ark. That's where they are. And we come in verse 10, and we're going to see another backstory come to fruition here, and you'll get it in a minute. Let me read it. And the Philistines fought, and Israel was defeated. They were defeated again. Now, they had the ark with them, but they were defeated. And they fled every man into his tent. And there was a very great slaughter, for there fell of Israel 30,000 footmen. Now we've got 34,000 killed in these two battles. Not only that, but in the midst of this, verse 11, the ark of God was taken. And the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were slain. Now remember, back in one of our last lessons about Samuel, how that Eli and his sons were identified, and it said that his sons did not know the Lord, and they were taking bribes and doing other financial crimes around the temple. And God spoke to Eli about being a soft parent and not stopping them from doing these things, and he proclaimed a curse that was going to happen. And so Eli knew it's very likely that God was going to take the lives of his sons. And they were slain in the battle. And then to follow that on up, look at verse 13. Now, there's a messenger that comes. I'm skipping over some of the verses here, between 11 and 13. There's a messenger that comes to tell Eli of the progress of the battle. In verse 13 it says, and when he came, lo, Eli sat upon a seat by the wayside watching, for his heart trembled for the ark of God. And when the man came into the city and told it, all of the city cried out. And when Eli heard the noise of the crying, he said, "What means the sound of this tumult?" And the man came hastily and told Eli. Now Eli was 98 years old, and his eyes were dim, that he could not see. And the man said unto Eli, "I am he that came out of the army, and I fled today out of the army." And he said, "What is there done, my son?" And the messenger answered and said, "Israel has fled before the Philistines, and there has also been a great slaughter among the people. And your 2 sons also, Hophni and Phinehas, are dead, and the ark of the Lord is taken." Now listen to me carefully in this next verse. "And it came to pass, when he heard mention of the ark of God," notice he says the ark of God. He doesn't say Hophni and Phinehas. So when it said that he heard of the ark of God, that he fell off from the seat backward by the side of the gate. And his neck broke, and he died, for he was an old man and heavy. And he had judged Israel 40 years. So now we see that Eli, this is the first time, the last mention of him here, the first time that the Bible speaks of him as a judge. But he was a judge prior to Samuel, and he judged 40 years. Well, sad thing. The battle goes bad. They're all chasing Israel. The sons have died. But Eli says, the ark. You know, it wasn't that his sons died that was created such a consternation. He knew that was coming, I suppose. And maybe he had steeled himself for that. When we heard that the ark had been taken, he just fell over backwards in consternation and fear, and he died. Well, let's keep on moving. We have much to cover here. The city's going to be destroyed. You know, we don't read that in the book of 1 Samuel, but we do read it in some of the other passages of Scripture found in other places. So let me just read a few. Psalm 78:60 says this, "So that he forsook the tabernacle of Shiloh, the tent with which he placed among men." Well, of course, his presence went with the ark, and so he's just reminding them in the book of Psalms about this story of how the ark was taken out of Shiloh and taken down to the Philistines first, and then it's going to land in another place in Israel. Jeremiah 7:12. Here again, just listen. "But go now unto my place, which is in Shiloh, where I set my name at first, and see what I did to it for the wickedness of my people Israel." Now, it's a very, very strong implication, even though it's not explicit, that God had leveled Shiloh. He said, "Go and see what I did because of what my people sinned against me." And then in Jeremiah 26:9, I think we have the longest one. "Why have you prophesied in the name of the Lord, saying, This house shall be like Shiloh, and this city shall be desolate without an inhabitant?" And all the people were gathered against Jeremiah in the house of the Lord. So they're saying to him, "Why are you prophesying what is happening to us like happened in Shiloh?" They knew that Shiloh had been destroyed. The people had taken the ark, and God was punishing them for that sin. He was punishing for their sin in general. And, of course, they lost both battles. Not a very happy story, is it? Well, the ark is going to travel now, and this is where I think I see something of the sense of humor that God has. The ark is going to travel. Remember, the Philistines have it, and what's going to happen to them? Well, it goes to Ashdod. We're going to turn the page to 1 Samuel 5, And we're going to see God contending with the great god Dagon, the god of people at Ashdod and several of the other cities around there. 1 Samuel 5:1. And the Philistines took the ark of God and brought it from Ebenezer into Ashdod. And when the Philistines took the ark of God, they brought it into the house of Dagon and set it by Dagon. All right, now let's just get this in mind. Dagon is a tall statue, as we understand. It may have been 30 feet high or something like that. And they came and they brought the ark next to it. So we've got Ashdod here and the ark next to it. And when they of Ashdod rose early in the morning, behold, Dagon had fallen upon his face to the earth before the ark of the Lord. Notice that preposition there. He wasn't beside, he was before. So somehow overnight, it had fallen down in front of the ark. Okay, fallen face to the earth before the ark of the Lord. And so what did they do? Well, I don't know what happened here, but we'll set him back up. So they put Dagon, set him back up in his place again beside the ark. Verse 4, when they arose early on the morning of the following morning, tomorrow's morning, behold, Dagon was fallen upon his face to the ground before the ark of the Lord. And not only that, the head of Dagon and both of the palms of his hands were cut off from the threshold. Only the stump of Dagon was left to him. So here he is. They come in the morning. Dagon is fallen, face to the ground before the ark of the Lord, and then the threshold of the temple, the body of it is there, as though the head had gone out over the threshold and got cut off. Only the stump of Dagon was left. Therefore, neither the priests of Dagon nor any that come into Dagon's house tread on the threshold of Dagon in Ashdod until this day. They're very superstitious. If God did this to Dagon and his head was cut off with that threshold, they're not going to step on it. And so they don't, he says, until this day. Now, see, God hasn't turned the ark into a magic thing. It's not a talisman. But the ark is very important to him. It's where he's declared that he would bring his presence when Israel was serving him and when it was in the tent of meeting in the tabernacle. And so it's very important to him. He's not going to let some other non-God piece of wood stand in an equal place with the arks beside him. That's the statement of equality. But instead, he brings Dagon, the statue of Dagon, to bow before him, where he would normally be there at the ark, and to be face down before him. Well, in verse 6 it says, but the hand of the Lord was heavy upon them of Ashdod, and he destroyed them, and smote them with tumors, even Ashdod and the coasts thereof. Now, this is a very interesting thing, and it's a very difficult thing. It's not very much by way of consensus about what these tumors were. It's translated tumors in some translations. It's translated emerods or hemorrhoids, actually, in another, because of a later passage which identifies the tumors with the anus of the men. They actually made special seats for their horses that would make it more comfortable to sit there. So some think it's hemorrhoids, others think it's just tumors in that part of the body and on their rear end. But that's what God did, and they were bloody, apparently bloody. So it was really very distasteful, very difficult, very uncomfortable. And God has a purpose behind this, as he does everything. But that's what happened. All right, let's go to the next city. We've been at the first city, Ashdod. So, what are they going to do about this? It's miserable. The ark is more trouble than it's been worth so far. So, in verses 7 through 9, we're going to read what happens here. Now, I've got verse 9 first. I want to read it first, and then I'll come back to 7 and 8. And so it was so that after they had carried it about, the hand of the Lord was against the city with very great destruction. And he smote the men of the city, both small and great, and they had amorites or hemorrhoids in their secret or private parts. Now you see why they're saying these were hemorrhoids. We don't know. Tumors in their private parts. Now let's go back and catch verse 7. And when the men of Ashdod saw that it was so, they said, the ark of the God of Israel shall not abide with us, for his hand is sore upon us and upon Dagon our God. So they don't want anything to do with this. So they sent therefore and gathered all of the lords of the Philistines unto them and said, what shall we do with the ark of God of Israel? And they answered, let the ark of God of Israel be carried about unto Gath. Now, let's just stop here and take a quick time out for a rabbit trail. What was the city of Gath? Does anybody remember that? If you were in my presence, I would have you answer it from the class. City of Gath. Well, you see, not too much later, this city is going to come up again, because that is the city that, brought out giants. Many large human beings lived there. And David and Goliath, remember that story? Goliath was a citizen of Gath. And so they're going to go to the city with the biggest, strongest warriors. And they're going to take the ark there. It'll be all right if it goes there. And so they carried the ark of God of Israel, I'm in verse 8, unto their city, both small and great. And they had hemorrhoids in their secret parts. God treated them just the same. Well, it's not going to stay there. They better keep it moving. It didn't do any good to take to this great warlike city. Let's try something else. Verse 10. Therefore they sent the ark of God to Ekron. And it came to pass, as the ark of God came to Ekron, that the Ekronites cried out, saying, they have brought about the ark of God of Israel to us, to slay us and our people. Well, they're panicking. What are they going to do? So they sent and gathered together all of the lords of the Philistines and said, send away the ark of the God of Israel, and let it go back again to its own place, that they may not slay us and our people. For there was a deadly destruction throughout all the city, and the hand of God was very heavy there. And the people that died not were smitten with the hemorrhoids, and the cry of the city went up to heaven. So we've got 3 straight cities, and every time they go into one of those cities, they have this miserable plague of tumors of some kind or hemorrhoids that come upon the men, and it's because God is concerned about what's happening to his ark, and he's going to let them know that that's not okay. So they decide they want to send it back to Israel. And I'm going to paraphrase now some of this for you, because otherwise I won't have time to finish the lesson. But they're going to send the ark back to Israel, and they had to make some preparations for that. First, they wanted to, of course, have some offerings to give to Israel if it went back. And so they formed there are actually 5 images of one kind and 5 images of another. One of the interesting bits of cultural history that fits here, and it also fits in some other places in more recent history, for instance, India, was that when people were defeated in battle and they decided to proffer for to submit to them for a peace treaty, they would make some images that related to the battle that had occurred to take to them. So guess what the Philistines did? They made images of these tumors. I don't know how you do that. I have no idea how you would do that. But they had images, 5 of them, one for each city. Apparently there were 2 other unmentioned cities that traveled to and also had the attack of the tumors. And then they had 5 other idols of mice, because in the midst of all this, what I didn't tell you was God sent them a plague of mice in the fields. So not only did they have the hemorrhoids or the tumors, but they had mice. And so they sent 5 mice, one for each town, that they were going to send to Israel as a peace offering. And they offered sacrifices to them before they sent them. This is happening. This whole story is happening. Well, we have the sending of the ark back to Israel, and what they're going to do, and what they've decided to do, is that they're going to send the cart by itself. They're going to let the oxen go whatever direction they want to go, and they know that up ahead there's a place in the road that forks. And they said to one another, if the ark goes, we'll say to the left, I don't know if it was or not, but we'll say to the left, then it's going to Israel, going back to Israel, and we should not have anything more to do with it. We'll know that this was their God that did this. But if it turns to the right up here, we know that that wasn't their God, and it's all right for us to continue to try to have that ark. It must have been something else that happened. So they watch, and this is the way they're going to decide. Depends on which way the ark goes. Well, it goes left. It's going to go back to Israel, and in fact, the ark goes to a place called Beth Shemesh, a town along the way, and we come to verse 14 here of 1 Samuel 6, and we read, then the cart came into the field of Joshua, a Beth Shemite, and stood there, where there was a great stone. Well, can you imagine the picture? You got a man in his household, I don't know what business he was in. Many of them, if not most of them, were sheep herders at that time, shepherds. But he's there with his men, and all of a sudden they see this wagon come pulling up next to the big stone that's at the entrance of their property. And they can't figure out what it is at first. They're seeing it from some distance, but as they watch it, it doesn't go anywhere. It just stops. God made those cows stop right there. So they figured it out. They figured it out. It must have been from the Lord. And so they broke apart, it says here in verse 14, they broke apart the wood of the cart and offered the cows a burnt offering unto the Lord. Well, that's a good start. And the Levites took down the ark of the Lord, and the coffer that was with it, wherein the jewels of gold were, and put them on the great stone. Okay, you got the picture? They're taking those little images of the tumors and of the mice, and they're setting up upon the top of the stone where the gate is. And the men of Beth Shemesh offered burnt offerings and sacrifices the same day unto the Lord. Okay, now, hold on. I said it was a good start, the idea that they wanted to offer a burnt offering unto the Lord, but then when they bring those idols out, you see they're doing the same thing that they've done so many times before. They're transferring the Lord's presence into these idols, to these 10 gold idols. And they're putting them up on top of the rock so everyone can see them, and then they're bringing everybody around and they said, let's worship. Well, God is not going to be happy with that, of course. And when the 5 lords of the Philistines had seen it, they returned to Ekron the same day. So that's the end of the Philistines for now. Verse 17. And these are the golden emerods which the Philistines returned for a trespass offering unto the Lord. For Ashdod one, for Gaza one, and Ashkelon one, and Gath one, and Ekron one. And the golden mice, according to the number of all the cities of the Philistines, belonging to the 5 lords, both of the fenced cities and the county villages, even unto the great stone of Abel, whereon they set down the ark of the Lord, which stone remains unto this day in the field of Joshua the Beth-Shemeshite. And he smote the men of Beth-Shemesh. Okay, I said a moment ago, God was not going to be happy over this. He smote the men of Beth-Shemesh because they had looked into the ark of the Lord. Even he smote the people, 50,010 men. And the people lamented because God had smitten so many of the people with a great slaughter. Oh, this is a time of judgment. First the 2 battles and the 34,000, and now 50,000 more because of God's anger toward their sin. Looking in the ark where his holy things were, and in idol worship of these images on the rock when they got them out. And the men of Beth-Shemesh said, Who is able to stand before this holy Lord God? And to whom shall he go up from us? Well, there's going to be one more move of this ark. We find it in chapter 7, verse 1. All right, we're all the way over to chapter 7 now. And the men of Kiriath-Jearim came and fetched up the ark of the Lord, and brought it into the house of Abinadab in the hill, and sanctified Eleazar his son to keep the ark of the Lord. So they took it from where it was, and they brought it up to Kiriath-Jearim. Hard to say, long word. And there was Eleazar, one of the priests, and his son to keep the ark of the Lord. And it stays there for a good long time. Well, so far we've seen the escapades of this group of Philistines who try to take the ark. They win the battles and they assume that they can take the ark, and then all kinds of bad things happen to them. And then they decide to get it back to Israel. It comes back, and Israel is judged over several things that we just saw. Now, as we finish this lesson, we want to come back and find Samuel. And I have titled in my outline, Samuel Teaches and Revival Comes. This is a wonderful ending to the story. There's going to be 20 years of silence. Look at it, 7:2. And it came to pass, while the ark stayed in Kiriath-Jearim, that the time was long, for it was 20 years. Now, very interestingly, that's all that was said. 20 years. Doesn't say what was happening in those 20 years. God doesn't tell us anything at all about the 20 years. We have to surmise and read between the lines, but it's here. You'll see it in a minute. And after the 20 years, it says that all of the house of Israel lamented after the Lord. Okay, here we are in that cycle again. 20 quiet years, but these are the 20 years under Samuel the judge. These are not bad times. These are good times. Remember, when the judge came, the children of Israel worshiped the Lord during the whole lifetime of that judge, it said there in the early chapters. But then when the judge died, then they would turn from the Lord and have to be punished. So this is during Samuel's judgeship. So you see the pattern is broken here. Israel is going to call out to the Lord after 20 years. Why? All of Israel lamented to the Lord. They made a request of the Lord. And Samuel's there in verses 3 to 9, and we continue the story here. Samuel spoke unto all the house of Israel, saying, If you do return unto the Lord, pardon me, it's my inflection, but I think that's what it means. If you do return unto the Lord with all of your hearts, then put away the strange gods and Ashtaroth from among you, and prepare your hearts unto the Lord, and serve him only, and he will deliver you out of the hands of the Philistines. All right, now I say these were good times because there were people that were serving in Israel, but apparently during these times of the judgeship of Samuel, there were some people that still were in this sin. It wasn't 100%, you see. And he was saying, I want all of you to put these idols away and serve only me. Echoes of the first commandment. And verse 5, Samuel said, Gather all Israel to Mizpah, and I will pray for you unto the Lord. And they gathered together to Mizpah, and drew water, and poured it out before the Lord, and fasted on that day, and said there, We have sinned against the Lord. And Samuel judged the children of Israel in Mizpah. And when the Philistines heard that the children of Israel were gathered together to Mizpah, the lords of the Philistines went up against Israel. And when the children of Israel heard it, they were afraid of the Philistines. And the children of Israel said to Samuel, Cease not to cry unto the Lord our God for us. Notice what they say. Don't cease not to cry unto the Lord our God. The Lord our God for us. That he will save us out of the hands of the Philistines. And Samuel took a suckling lamb and offered it for a burnt offering holy unto the Lord. And Samuel cried out unto the Lord of Israel, and the Lord heard him. Well, let's go on, because God's going to act. Verse 10. As Samuel was offering up the burnt offering, the Philistines drew near to attack Israel. But the Lord thundered with a mighty sound that day against the Philistines and threw them into confusion, and they were defeated before Israel. You know, it's really something that our God has such a powerful voice that just one roar sends a whole army into confusion. Isn't it great? All he has to do is let him hear his voice for a little bit. Well, in verses 11 through 15, we're coming near the end of Samuel's life. It says in verse 11, The men of Israel went out to Mizpah and pursued the Philistines and smote them until they came under Bethkar. Then Samuel took a stone and set it between Mizpah and Shen, and called the name of it Ebenezer, saying, Hitherto has the Lord helped us. Or the Lord has helped us this far is another way of translating that. So the Philistines were subdued, and they came no more into the coast of Israel. And the hand of the Lord was against Israel all the days of Samuel. I'm sorry, I said it wrong. And the hand of the Lord was against the Philistines. Boy, that was a mistake, wasn't it? Against the Philistines all the days of Samuel. And the cities which the Philistines had taken from Israel were restored to Israel, from Ekron even unto Gath. And the coasts thereof did Israel deliver out of the hands of the Philistines. And there was peace between Israel and the Amorites. And so, in Samuel's days, all of his days, God put down the Philistines, put down the Amorites. Israel had a larger area that they controlled in peace than ever. They had all of it to the west of the river and the lakes, and all of it to the east, the Amorites. And it is said in verse 15, And Samuel judged Israel all of the days of his life. You know, that's not said about any other person in Scripture. Samuel judged Israel all the days of his life. Meaning that God had formed him as a judge in the womb, and when his mother gave him to the temple and gave him to God, she lended him to God, that in his God's eyes he was already the judge. He had placed him in his own position there. And when Samuel came to know the Lord, and the Lord was with him all of his days, he was a judge in Israel. Well, you know, you have to ask, what was happening here? What was different about this? Well, I remember a few weeks ago when I was talking about Samuel, near the end of one of the lessons, we read this verse that said that Samuel went from town to town. Remember I pointed out that he had a circuit that he followed as a judge. He went from town to town. And it was said that when he prophesied, God didn't let any of his words drop to the ground, meaning he fulfilled the requirements of a prophet. But he was going around from town to town. Now, prophets do two different things. Sometimes they foretell what God is going to do, and other times they forthtell. We actually have a kind of a prophetic ministry today in the mouth of our pastors. They forthtell. They're prophesying in a way. You know what Samuel was doing, I believe? I think it would be so easy to see this and hard to prove it wrong. When he had that circuit of cities that he visited as the judge, that Samuel was teaching the people anew about God's law and God's person and who he was. So that during that 20 years of silence, it was silent to us, but there was a lot going on. Samuel was traveling and teaching, and traveling and teaching, and traveling and teaching. And Israel came to know more about God in this period of the judges than any other period, so that they're going to rise up of their own and demand that they follow the Lord, that Israel follow the Lord. Now, I've got just a few minutes, about 5 minutes. Let's just see if I can hurry and get through this, and I want you to have the blessing of that last point. The people are going to ask for a king. Chapter 8, look there. And it came to pass when Samuel was old that he made his sons judges over Israel. Well, Samuel has a couple of sons too. And there's going to be a startling resemblance between his sons and Eli's, but there's a difference. Verses 2 and 3. Now the name of his first son was Joel, and the name of the second one was Abiah. And they were judges in Beersheba. Samuel had given them judgeship because he'd gotten so old that he wasn't able to travel much anymore. But look at verse 3. And his sons walked not in his ways, but turned aside after money, and took bribes, and perverted judgment. Now, we might be tempted to say, well, now here's the negative mark on Samuel. He didn't bring his boys up as he should, just like Eli didn't. However, from the language that's used here, and my understanding as best I can, I don't really know too much about it, but in the English language, and then of course looking up what I was able to do in Hebrew, I'm not a Hebrew scholar. It seems to me that what they're talking about here, or what God is talking about here, is that his sons were brought up as judges, they took the place as judges, and they were okay for a while. But then, when he made them into judges, they walked away from God. They were backslidden. It's the difference in today's generation between somebody that's not saved, because God clearly says Eli's sons did not know the Lord. He doesn't say anything about Samuel's sons here. He just says that they started taking bribes and so on. So I have to believe that this is not a critique of Samuel as it was of Eli, but a statement of the case that as adult sons, they chose to move in a sinful direction. And so Samuel is not blamed for it here. And now we're going to have what I call a good rebellion. Chapter 8 and verse 4. Then all of the elders of Israel, remember these elders had been taught for 20 years. All of the elders of Israel gathered themselves together and came to Samuel at Ramah, and said unto him, Behold, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now make us a king to judge over us, like all the nations. Well, I got excited after I read that first part. Here's a rebellion. They're coming and saying, we can't have your sons do this. It's wrong. During the time of Eli, there was just confusion. But the people of Israel now know better. And so they come to Samuel and say, you can't have your sons do that. But then the second part is the third coming of the request that's anathema, and that is, we want a king. Remember who the first king of Israel was? Yeah, Abinadab. And that's probably an answer that most people don't know, but he was. He tried to be king for 3 years. That ended. And then we go into the period of the judges. People want to make Gideon king. He says, no way. No, not me or my sons are going to be king. Now here's the third time. And of course this is distressing to Samuel in verse 6. But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, give us a king to judge us. And Samuel prayed unto the Lord. Samuel never left his roots. He won't go right to the Lord. And in verse 7 we read, and pardon me, tell nonsense of that cough. And the Lord said unto Samuel, hearken unto the voice of the people and all that they say to you. Pardon me again. I don't have COVID, but I do have a cough. Sorry. Hearken unto the voice of the people, for they have not rejected you, they have rejected me, because I should not reign over them. In other words, Samuel, it's not your fault. They're rejecting me, and I will deal with that, the Lord is saying, but it's not your fault. According to all the works which they have done since the day that I brought them up out of Egypt, even unto this day, wherewith they have forsaken me, and served other gods, so do they also unto you. Now therefore hearken unto their voice, howbeit yet protest solemnly unto them, and show them the manner of the king that shall reign over them. And Samuel told all of the words of the Lord unto the people that asked him a king. Now, that was chapter 8. Chapter 9, two things happen. God's going to lead Samuel to Saul, and Samuel is going to die. What a great judge, the greatest of the judges. And trust that this has been a blessing. Have a good week. And remember, God can use you if you just trust him this week. Bye now.